There is a category of online review that I take great delight in, and that might be called online reviews by people who have perhaps missed the point. This includes a Google review of Australia, woke, I think assuming that everyone in the country was Crocodile Dundee, a Google review of Whitney Plantation near my hometown that said they talked entirely too much about slavery and resisted the urge to talk about nice white people who tried to make it better. There's a review of Yosemite National Park that says the trees block the view and there are too many big gray rocks. And once I received a Google review that said, they're very nice, they will welcome you with open arms, but beware, for they are not real Christians. And I said, correctly observed. But I'm glad we were very nice and welcomed you with open arms. The history of Unitarian Universalism and Unitarianism and Universalism is a long history of telling us we aren't real Christians. And these days, I can find that pretty funny. But for a long time, that was not funny at all to the people who first called themselves Unitarians and first called themselves Universalists. For a long time, that was hurtful, possibly dangerous, and against everything that they believed they were. The early Unitarians and the early Universalists did not envision a post-Christian, multiracial, multi-religious community where the minister wore bright purple. This was not their vision for the world. What small vision they had. I like to think some of them would have been excited. But the early Unitarians and the early Universalists understood themselves as Christians. Christians with doctrinal differences, and Christians who took their Christianity seriously enough to try to actually communicate those doctrinal decisions and disagreements. The early Unitarians, thus named because they rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. Side note, they did not call themselves that. The Trinitarians called them that, and they were like, I guess that's who we are now. Rejected the idea of God in one, of the unity of God, of the Trinity that all became one, and said, no, really just one, probably. But that actually wasn't the doctrine that they were most focused on. It's just the one they got named after. The early Unitarians rejected the doctrine of predestination, which said that before you were born, before your parents were born, your ultimate faith was already mapped out. Your whole life and your afterlife. So before you were born, or when you were born, where there's this baby with all the possibility that a new life brings, young and perfect and unmolded by anything, that God has already decided if that baby is going to heaven and hell. And in that taxonomy, usually the answer was hell. And the early Unitarians said that seems profoundly unfair, that we don't have choices in our lives, that we can't affect how our lives will go now and what will happen to us when we die. They weren't arguing that there wasn't a God. They weren't arguing that there wasn't a heaven and a hell. They just thought they ought to have some say in it. They thought that the Christianity that they espoused should be more fair. And the early Universalists thought about the fact of a loving God, and then thought about the notion of eternal damnation, and could not square those two things together. They were told that their God loved them as a parent loves his children. We would add hers, but this was the 1700s, it was his. that their God loved them as a parent loves his children, and they looked at their own children, and they thought, I cannot imagine my child doing anything that would make me want them to suffer for eternity. And how can God love his children less than I love mine? How can God be more vengeful than I am? How can God be capable of less forgiveness than a person? And they said that we want a Christianity with more love, where we take seriously God's love for us. The Unitarians said we want a faith that's more fair, and the Universalists wanted a faith with more love. And they shared this, what I'm sure they thought was good news, with all their fellow Christians, and their fellow Christians were not amused. Because imagine you're at work and probably someone new, who you think doesn't have as much experience as you, comes up to you and says, you're doing it wrong. Have you thought about doing it the way I do it? Have you ever received that feedback well? Even the times they were right? Honestly, isn't it worse when they're right? And it's not just that. I like to play a little and imagine it's just people being like, you can't tell me what to do. But it's not just that. The people who held the doctrine of predestination, the people who believed in hell, believed in it. It was important to their way of seeing the world, of their way of engaging with a world that was often hard and unfair and unloving. And it is unsurprising that their God and their faith reflected a world that was often unfair and unloving. And I like to think that those early Unitarians and early Universalists approached their fellow human beings and Christians in the spirit of love and humility, of let's all explore together. But sometimes when we think we're right, we don't communicate that in the most helpful of ways. I can imagine some excited, fired up, newly converted Universalist going up to someone, say their mom, and saying, how could you believe? Don't you know? Haven't you ever thought? When we come to places where we have sincere disagreements about the way the world works, about how God works, about the rules that we think might govern the universe, we will be in conflict. And sometimes it is healthy, productive conflict. And sometimes we shun people and send them away from us. Sometimes we are the established church saying, if everyone becomes Unitarians and Universalists, anarchy will reign in the streets. How will people live godly lives if they're not afraid of God? As though the only thing keeping us from running around like wild people was because we were scared of some future punishment. Anyone who has ever had a toddler knows future punishment, not that effective. We were told, our early religious ancestors were told, if you start here, where's it going to end? 1 minute it's universal salvation. The next minute people are going to be willy-nilly doing whatever they want. They're going to get rid of God. They're going to be sleeping in on Sundays, reading the New York Times instead of going to church. Oh dear, they were right. It was a slippery slope that we slid right on down. Because while our early ancestors were saying, no, just this one thing. We just need to make one small, minor correction, and then everything will be fine. The thing is, once you start asking questions, they tend to be followed by more questions. Once you say that one sacred cow can be looked at and talked about, the other sacred cows start sneaking their way into the pews. Once you start saying maybe not, or maybe yes, we tend to keep going. And it's easy in retrospect to say, yeah, probably most of us don't identify as Christians anymore. Or yeah, probably most of us do not believe in the fatherhood of God. Not all of us, but most of us. But at the time, to admit that would have been really hard. To admit you believed a different thing from all the people you loved and all the people who surrounded you would have been really hard. I think it is a sign not that the people asking those questions didn't take their faith seriously, but a sign that they took it so seriously they couldn't not ask. Because if it was something you held lightly, it would have been easier to just not mention it. If you were like, probably not, but I can get there, you'd have stayed with the people who you loved and the people who had always believed the things you believed. The truth about Unitarian Universalists is that we are people for whom asking the question, wrenching as it is easier than not asking it. Making a change, hard as that is easier than not making it. And so over the years, we kept asking, and we kept changing and shifting, and each time was a little wrenching, because each time there were people who we loved who we had to leave, at least spiritually. Each time we had to grapple with it. Is this a rich enough and deep enough question that it is worth being in conflict with people I love and people I respect and people I care about? And so we slowly moved and moved and moved, so that in 1933, when the Humanist Manifesto, which was as big a shock as it sounds, was put out, over half the signatories were Unitarian ministers, which is, I think, confusing for some people who still thought they were Christians. We slowly move. We are a people who have had to accept that there's no stopping place on the religious journey. We're not headed to a place where we will stay. We are headed to a place from which we will go to the next place, where we will be a place that aren't real Christians, but man, they were nice when we visited. We are people who take our faith so seriously that we change it all the time. And so, this is part one of this conversation. You're going to have to come back in 2 weeks. Building audience retention. Over the next year, the worship committee, me, the worship associates, all of you will be exploring the new values that the Unitarian Universalist Association has espoused, our newest and latest faith statement that we make, knowing that someday we will make a new one. Someday, people will look back and say, they're very nice and very welcoming, but they barely even mention the principles. And I look forward to that day. For now, I would invite you to go into the world and into your spirit, knowing that we are people who take ourselves seriously enough to know that we will be wrong eventually. And 2 weeks from now, we will do from principles and purposes to flying on a jet pig. And if that's confusing, you'll have to come back and hear all about it. And now we're going to listen to some music.